From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Friday, October 4th. It's been a long time since Oregon voters have elected a Republican to statewide office. The last one was Dennis Richardson, who died while serving his term as Secretary of State in 2019. But this election cycle, voters will pick a new Secretary of State, a new Attorney General, and a new Treasurer. Will voters finally choose a Republican to serve in the upper echelons of state government? We'll discuss. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Lauren Dake.
I'm OPB Legal Affairs and Justice reporter Conrad Wilson.
I'm OPB Business reporter Kyra Buckley.
Conrad, let's start with you and the race for Attorney General. Ellen Rosenblum has held the seat for a long time. I actually remember the day that John Kitzhaber swore her in 2012. It was a big deal because she was the Oregon's first female Attorney General. Now we have two candidates running, two white men in their mid-40s. They both attended law school at Willamette University, so they have that in common. But they also obviously have many differences that we're going to dig into. But let's start with the guy who listeners of this podcast are already fairly familiar with, former House Speaker Dan Rayfield.
That's right. Rayfield is the Democrat in the race. He's a personal injury attorney. As he pointed out, he spent a decade representing the Corvallis area in the Oregon legislature. He became Speaker of the House in 2022 until he stepped down this year to run for Attorney General. And, he's sort of like the political establishment in a way. I mean, he says that if he's elected, he's really going to build on his work in politics and his work in the law. And so here's what he had to say about that.
If you look around every community in Oregon, there are a host of issues that we're seeing, whether it's housing and homelessness or it's the substance abuse crisis, or you see seniors and consumers that are being taken advantage of in their community. The Attorney General's office in Oregon, with the right leadership, can have an important impact on those issues, and that's why I wanted to run for this position.
Rayfield says that he'd focus on the environment, reproductive rights. I asked him sort of, so you'd be kind of building on the work that Attorney General Rosenblum has done. And he said, yeah, that's, I think there's some things to do in the consumer protection space that he would like to focus on. But really, he said that it would be some of those things, some of her policy ideas and her agenda is also his agenda. He's raised over $1 million. And really, Rayfield is seen as a major force in Democratic politics in Oregon. At the same time, this is a statewide race, and so he's sort of tacking to the middle, too.
There have been years where Ellen Rosenblum just sort of handily won her race for re-election. One of her opponents at one point was not even a lawyer, which apparently is not required to oversee the state's Department of Justice. But this election cycle, Will Lathrop, he's a former prosecutor, he's an international human rights worker, and he's raising real money.
That's right, yeah. Will Lathrop is the Republican in the race. As you pointed out, he's a former prosecutor in Marion and Yamhill counties. He recently returned to the United States after working for a Christian human rights nonprofit in Uganda and Ghana that did a lot of work with human trafficking. And he's running on his experience in law enforcement, prosecuting crimes such as homicides, human trafficking. And he keeps stressing that, he's not a politician. And at the same time, he's pushing back against the Democratic political establishment.
Our former speaker goes to governor. Our current speaker now wants to go to attorney general. The treasurer goes to secretary of state. It's just like this musical chairs of the same people who voted for and did all of the things you're frustrated by. And so I think what becomes difficult is to say, can I trust a Republican to enforce the law? And so I wouldn't ask people to see me as a Republican. I would just ask them to see me as the only person in this race with law enforcement experience.
He also raised, that's Will Lathrop, he's also raised about $1 million or so. And, as it sounds like there, he as you can hear in his voice, he's really pushing, a public safety message at a time when that's something voters say they're concerned about.
So the two candidates have pretty different messages. Let's just step back and remind us what the Attorney General in the state actually does and how much leeway either of these two men will have in how they oversee the agency.
So it is a massive job. And actually, in some ways, it isn't even really so much a criminal justice job as it is sort of being the attorney for the state, right? The Attorney General, folks have told me that it's you're really running Oregon's largest law firm, the Oregon Department of Justice. The agency boasts a nearly $900 million biannual budget. There's 1,500 employees. And really, the department defends state laws and agencies in court. The Attorney General is also responsible for protecting residents through lawsuits against the federal government. When companies lie or cheat, there's like consumer protections things that the state can step in and say, we were done, Oregonians were harmed, and so they'll file lawsuits. There's also like some, wiggle room where, whoever is in that job can prioritize certain things, right? And under Rosenblum, there's been things like the environment, reproductive rights that have been really, really important to her. So it's a big, big job. And some of it you have to do. Other parts you can kind of prioritize over others.
Okay, final question for you, Conrad, before we move on. The other two races we're about to discuss, they both have Republican candidates who are prohibited from seeking re-election for their legislative seats because they participated in a legislative walkout. And it seems like it's probably fair to say that their bid for office is a bit more of a long shot than Will Lathrop's. But at the same time, Lathrop is up against Dan Rayfield, who you mentioned earlier really has the Democratic political machine behind him. So this is basically a very long wind-up to essentially ask you, does a Republican candidate in this race have a shot?
Yes. This is arguably Republicans' best chance to win a statewide office. At a time when Democrats hold power at really all levels in Salem. Lathrop is really leaning into this public safety message, even though that's not even really maybe all that encompasses what the Attorney General does. But yeah, if you look at what happened with the Multnomah County District Attorney's race, right? You have this, that's a nonpartisan race. It's not a direct comparison, but you have this progressive Democrat, Mike Schmidt, who is the district attorney, and he lost to Nathan Vasquez, who just until a few years ago was a registered Republican, but it was over this message of public safety, and if that message can win in very progressive Democratic stronghold of Multnomah County, I think it shows that that's just a very powerful message that could resonate statewide.
Kyra, let's switch to you and the race for state treasurer, where, again, we have a Republican who cannot seek re-election because he participated in a legislative walkout, and that's Republican Senator Brian Boquist. He's facing State Senator Elizabeth Steiner. She's the Democrat. First, let's just start out. Can you tell us about Senator Boquist?
Yeah, he's a little bit of a colorful character, and he's made some headlines a few times in recent years. We'll talk about that in a second. But as for his background, Boquist grew up on a dairy farm here in Oregon, and before serving in state government, he was a Special Forces lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. He's been a state lawmaker since 2004, and he's currently serving in the state Senate.
Okay, you sort of alluded to his colorfulness. He made some pretty bold comments during the 2019 legislative walkout when Republicans left the state house protesting a climate change bill. Remind us about those.
Yeah, so that was when then Governor Kate Brown suggested sending state police to bring those GOP lawmakers back to Salem. Boquist publicly warned the state troopers to, quote, only send bachelors and come heavily armed. So now on a more mild note, when I asked him why he's running for state treasurer, here's what he told me.
We've been going down the same status quo road for 5 decades. I sort of said, okay, here's a choice. We need to get some transparency back in this.
And when he says we've been going down the same status quo road, he really means democratic rule. So the Democrats have held state offices for a long time, as we have mentioned. And Boquist told me that he would focus on growing the state's treasury.
His Democratic challenger is Senator Elizabeth Steiner. She's served in the state legislature alongside him for a long time. She was the co-chair of the powerful budget writing committee, Ways and Means, which feels like a pretty applicable job skill for this role.
Yeah, definitely. And I should note, though, Steiner's actually a family physician by trade, but she has been serving in the state Senate since 2011. And the position she wants now as treasurer is basically the state bookkeeper. So the treasurer really watches over the treasury, which you can kind of think of as Oregon's bank account. And so they're the steward of that treasury, and it pays for things like roads or like for the state police or pensions for public employees. But Steiner said the position also helps create savings programs for regular Oregonians.
And through a variety of savings mechanisms that the treasurer is responsible for, and through financial literacy programs that the treasurer has been working on, there are some incredible opportunities.
She told me she wants to expand those efforts. I should also say that Steiner is expected to win this seat. She's the only candidate that's raised a significant amount in campaign donations. And Lauren, you already mentioned this, but this race is an open seat because the current treasurer, Tobias Reed, is running for Secretary of State.
Yes, another well-known person in Oregon political circles. Like you said, he's currently serving as treasurer. He's a former state lawmaker. He also ran for governor against Tina Kotek in the Democratic primary. He obviously lost that. I would say he ran slightly more to the center than she did. So his treasurer term is up. He's running for Secretary of State. And, he said one of his primary goals is to restore trust to this office. It has seen a lot of turnover lately. Like I said, up top, Dennis Richardson died in 2019 while serving his term. Then he was replaced by Bev Clarno. Then Shamia Fagan was elected to the role. And in a really stunning fall from grace, she was forced to resign after Willamette Week reported she had this side gig contracting with a cannabis company, which is an industry that her agency audited. So then Kotek appointed a replacement. There's just been a lot of changes. So Reed's primary goal here is to bring stability to this office.
And the other commonality here, and we've touched on this, is that both the race for state treasurer and the race for Secretary of State have Republican candidates who cannot run for re-election because they participated in walkouts.
Yeah, this podcast is making it really clear that this is very much a small pool of people who are quite interwoven running for these statewide offices. So Reed's opponent is State Senator Dennis Lithicum. He also participated in the longest ever legislative walkout. He is also prohibited from seeking re-election to his seat in the state Senate. Like Boquist, he's running for the statewide seat. And it's really an interesting role for him because he is very skeptical of our election integrity. He actually filed a lawsuit after the 2020 election questioning the validity of vote by mail. It's worth mentioning here that vote by mail has been in the news recently because the DMV did mistakenly enroll more than 1,000 people on the voter rolls who were non-citizens. And this has really served to bolster Lithicum's argument that vote by mail is not safe and it's not transparent. And that is a really key difference between these two candidates. Lithicum thinks there are better ways to vote, while Tobias Reed, the Democrat, said, yeah, he was really appalled by this DMV error, but he still believes in vote by mail. He still believes it could serve as a national model. Anyway, lots of choices for voters. You guys, I think that we have covered it. Let's leave the conversation there today. Kyra and Conrad, thanks for doing this.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
This episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded in the Gert Boyle studio here at OPB. It was produced by Andrew Thien with audio engineering from Nalene Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. If you just cannot get enough of Politics Now and you want to see us in person, join us for a live taping of the podcast next week. That's Thursday, October 10th at the Tomorrow Theater in Southeast Portland. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. While you're there, you can also become an OPB member. You can also rate and review us in your podcast app of choice or listen along on YouTube. Lots of options. Thank you for your support and thank you for listening.